So now you are John D. Rockefeller. The dawn of the 20th century, the year is 1911, and you control 90% of all oil refining capacity in the United States. You didn't just win a market, you annihilated it. You crushed competitors through price wars they could not survive. You dictated prices behind closed doors. You starved rivals of rail access. You forced compliance through sheer scale, logistics, and vertical integration. And in doing so, you conquered capitalism by playing it harder, colder, and more ruthlessly than anyone before you. You didn't merely dominate oil, you became oil itself, the undisputed magnate, the central nervous system of an economy that now depended on your pipelines, your refineries, your transport routes, and your agreements. And even when the Supreme Court orders the breakup of Standard Oil into 34 separate companies, a decision meant to dismantle your empire, this moment only amplifies your power. Because you don't lose control, you multiply it. Ownership fragments on paper while influence remains centralized. Your former monopoly transforms into a web of interlocking directorates, shared shareholders, coordinated interests, and silent alignment. Your wealth peaks at $900 million, a number so extreme that in today's terms it would require the combined fortunes of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates just to approach it. And at that altitude, money loses meaning. Because once wealth is secured for 70 generations or more, accumulation becomes trivial, the scoreboard is broken. What matters now is permanence, influence, the ability to shape outcomes without appearing to act, control over systems rather than assets, writing the rules instead of competing inside them, deciding what is possible, acceptable, and unthinkable. And the most effective weapon you discover is not violence, not legislation, not brute political power, but philanthropy. Because people can hate a monopolist, they can despise a robber baron, but they cannot hate a benefactor. So you begin to give, deliberately, strategically, selectively, with precision. You create the Rockefeller Foundation, and behind the image of generosity, you quietly construct an architecture where everything people do, how they study, how they work, how they heal, how they think, flows through institutions funded by you. A system designed not to last election cycles or decades, but centuries. An invisible machine that reshapes schools, hospitals, governments, science, media, and minds long after your death. This is how the Rockefeller matrix is born, silent, refined, deeply embedded, and almost impossible to escape. Because at the start of the 20th century, your public image is toxic. Secret cartels, supplier manipulation, predatory practices that wiped competitors off the map, generate nationwide hatred. Newspapers paint you as dangerous. Politicians fear you. Workers curse your name. But hatred dissolves when power disguises itself as charity. And by funding universities, research institutes, hospitals, public health initiatives, and scientific boards, you are not simply donating money, you are defining direction. Because whoever pays chooses the music and you know exactly what you want. The world to hear? The primary targets are education and health because controlling what people learn and how they treat their bodies is controlling society itself at the deepest level, and the first gear of this system is the classroom. At the time, American education is decentralized, local community-based, inconsistent, unpredictable, shaped by regional needs and independent teachers, which is unacceptable for someone thinking at industrial scale. Factories don't need philosophers, they don't need rebels, they don't need independent thinkers, they need compliant workers who arrive on time, follow instructions, repeat tasks, respect hierarchy, and don't ask dangerous questions. So foundation-backed reports begin promoting standardized schooling, uniform curricula, centralized accreditation, rows of desks facing authority, bells that train obedience to external signals, repetitive instruction optimized for memorization rather than understanding, all modeled after factory logic. And this is not hidden or accidental. Frederick Gates writes openly that the goal is not to create thinkers, scientists, or intellectuals, but to teach children to do perfectly what their parents did imperfectly. Modern education emerges as an assembly line of obedience, not to cultivate wisdom, creativity, or autonomy, but to manufacture human components suited for an industrial machine, and by financing education boards, accreditation bodies, teacher training programs, and elite universities, you ensure this model spreads nationwide and becomes the default 12 mandatory years of mechanical memorization that do not create thinkers but functional illiterates. People trained to repeat information without truly understanding it, unable to interpret complex texts, question authority, or challenge dominant narratives, a population conditioned to comply. Disciplined enough to work, distracted enough not to revolt with minimal social mobility baked into the structure. Today, parents do not choose whether to opt out of this system. Those who try are punished, fined, criminalized, forced to surrender their children to a structure that teaches everything except independent thought, producing adults who wait for instructions, trust whatever government and media repeat, internalize official narratives, and rarely question the stories they are told. But this is only the first layer of the machine, because a system that shapes minds must also regulate bodies, behavior, and dependency. And this is where medicine becomes not just a profession, but an instrument. Before your intervention medicine is fragmented, plural, rooted in local knowledge, herbal traditions, holistic approaches, and community healers, power is dispersed and outcomes are unpredictable, something no monopolist can tolerate. So you move to standardize health the same way you standardize labor and education through funding, accreditation, and institutional authority. The Flexner Report becomes the turning point, not merely a reform, but a purge. Hundreds of medical schools close. Entire traditions disappear from official recognition. And a single model rises to dominance, laboratory-based, chemically driven, capital-intensive, perfectly aligned with industrial production and patent law. And here the circle closes. Because petroleum, once refined into fuel, now becomes medicine. Oil transforms into pharmaceuticals. And illness becomes not just a condition, but a market. Doctors are trained to diagnose and prescribe within narrow frameworks. Prevention is secondary, lifestyle is peripheral, and treatment becomes an ongoing transaction. Patients enter the system once and rarely leave it because cures are less profitable than management. And alongside medicine, you secure control over science itself because research without funding cannot exist. Grants determine what questions are asked, what hypotheses are explored, and what conclusions are acceptable. Lines of inquiry that threaten the model quietly disappear, not through bans, but through starvation. While journalism follows the same pattern, newspapers and later broadcast media depend on advertising, and advertising depends on the same industrial and pharmaceutical interests. So narratives converge. Dissenting voices are framed as unscientific, irresponsible, or dangerous, and the public experiences this convergence as consensus, as common sense, as reality itself. By the time you die in 1937, the structure no longer needs you. It has momentum. It trains its own administrators, rewards compliance, marginalizes deviation, and reproduces itself across generations. Schools teach obedience, universities credential conformity, medicine manages bodies, media manages perception, and politics manages appearances, all operating inside boundaries set long before the people inside them were born. And this is the final layer of your legacy, not domination through force, but domination through normalization, where power no longer needs to announce itself because it feels like nature, like progress, like the only possible way the world could work. And so even as decades pass, as technologies change, as new billionaires rise and fall, the underlying architecture remains intact, invisible but ever present. And every time someone sits in a classroom, follows a medical protocol, consumes a headline, or trusts an institutional authority without questioning its origin, they are not just participating in modern society. They are moving through a system whose foundations were poured by you, a system so deeply embedded that escaping it requires first seeing it, and seeing it is the one thing it was never designed to allow.